the char of the cities. And similarly, the Ottomans called the city as Astana or Asitane, meaning the capital, or Bab-ı Ali, which means the great gate, or Dar Saadet, the gate of happiness. So this was the terminology, the names of the city over the centuries. If you take a look at Fernand Brodda's work on the Mediterranean, you will see a lot, he says about Constantinople or other cities in the Mediterranean. Constantinople is a city of mobility, exchange, hybridity, and coexistence. It's a bridge between continents and civilizations. It's a city which mediates and circulates, symbols, cultures, religions, ethnicity. It's a city of plurality and coexistence, which has always been heterogeneous in terms of nationalities, religions, cultures. It's a city which is negating the rigid binaries between East and West. It is actually third space, using the terminology from the works of Baba, Stuart Hall, or Lefebvre, or Edward Soja. So it is this city where you have cosmopolitanism erected in the bazaar, ports, caravan routes, coffee houses, and maritime trade all across the city. If you just take a look at the history of the city in terms of the human mobility, you will be, shocked, or you will be surprised to see so many different tribes, so many different nations, so many different cultures and groups and ethnicities have been in the city and have been settled in this city. Slavic people, Vikings, Romanis, Turks, Poles, Circassians, White Russians, Bosphorus Germans, Syrians, and then many others. I'll just very briefly go through the story of these groups of people to make my point rather more clear. This city has been in the intersection of various tribes and cultures, religious empires, and traditions. Just to give you an example, the Arabs tried to take the city from the Byzantine Empire in the early centuries. And the Byzantine emperor, in order to protect the city, brought millions of Slavic warriors, Slavic tribes from the Balkans to the Asia Minor to protect the city against the invasion of the Arabs. And Byzantine efforts also were visible to strengthen the city against the Arabs, and other tribes also included welcoming Viking warriors into the city during the same period. In the meantime, various Roma groups and Turks followed these groups of people towards Constantinople, pushing the city from the Balkans and the eastern shores in the 10th century, such as the Pechenegs, Selçuks, Ottomans, and the other Turkic Anatolian tribes. So we have seen the city was becoming more and more Islamized since the Ottoman visibility in the city, in Anatolia, in Asia Minor. So, and now the city is witnessing some other groups of people. In the, let's say, 2000s, there were many Europeans visiting the city. But today, when you look at the city, when you look at the public spaces in the city, you see more and more visibility of the Arabs, of the Middle Eastern people, of the Gulf people, of the Syrian refugees, of the Afghans, of the Pakistanis. So this doesn't really change the fact that it has always been a third space where many different traditions mingle with each other in an amalgamation of cultures in a way. For instance, just a few years ago, the archaeologists found a settlement, a very old settlement of the Vikings, dating between the 9th century and the 11th centuries, very nearby where we live at the moment, in the European side of Istanbul. this was the settlement of the Viking soldiers who were brought by the Byzantine emperor to protect the city, to protect the emperor against outside intruders. So these people were called Varangians by the Byzantium people. It was a mixture of Vikings and the Normans who were mixed with the Slavs in the Balkans. So Byzantine and Slavic sources call the Vikings as Varangians, which means sworn companions. These Varangians and Slavic tribes formed the people called Rus in the literature, and it's also called Rutsi in the Finnish language. So it is really interesting how the history unfolds itself, making an impact from Constantinople to the other parts of Europe. Another community of people which is really interesting here is the Roma people, in brackets gypsies. Roma people coming from India even earlier than the Turkish visibility in the Asia Minor in the 11th century. So Roma communities were even more autochthonous than the Turkish communities, so to speak. They were settled around the city walls of Istanbul, of Constantinople, and they lived until quite recently, unfortunately, because of the gentrification of that district of the city. Roma people had to leave their authentic places to go to the other parts of the city. Another really interesting group of people who were settled in Istanbul were the Polish people escaping from the atrocities of the Russians and also of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's hostilities. So in the 19th century, a few hundreds of Poles were settled in a district of Istanbul called Adampol, which is currently called Polonezköy, a Polish village. And this village is still vibrant there, hosting still a couple of Polish origin migrant families and their descendants. So again, the city is there, hosting refugees escaping from the hostilities within the European continent in a way. And another group of people, which I have personally worked as an anthropologist over the last 20 years, were the Circassians. Circassians were escaping from the Russian atrocities in the last quarter of the 19th century, and they were settled in different parts of Turkey, as well as Istanbul. And they were settled in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Israel, and Turkey by the Ottoman Empire in order to protect the empire from the centrifugal nationalist forces such as the Arab nationalism, or Greek nationalism, or Bulgarian nationalism, or other forms of nationalism, Kurdish nationalism in Anatolia as well. So this is also really another very large group of people who were settled in this geography. And we still have quite a lot of remnants of these communities in Istanbul, including the white Russian refugees who came to Istanbul after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So approximately 150,000 white Russians escaping from the Bolsheviks found a refuge in Istanbul, mostly nobles, soldiers, and then the number even increased after the loss of Crimea to the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. So the last group of people that I want to bring into your attention is the Bosphorus Germans, who have been in Istanbul since the mid-19th century. Those were the people who were working in the construction of as engineers, of course, as skilled labor, in the construction of Berlin-Baghdad railway. And then because of the military alliance between the Ottomans and the Germans, there were hundreds of, pashas or soldiers, high-ranking soldiers also came and lived in Istanbul and the other parts of Asia Minor. And also during the Nazi period, there were hundreds of scientists escaping from Germany, mostly, of course, Jewish origin, such as Ernst Reuter, Erich Auerbach, Ernest Hirsch, etc. They were also hosted. They were also settled in places like Istanbul, Ankara. So this is really interesting how the peoples of Europe and peoples of Asia Minor or Turkey have been interacting in so many different ways through migration, through asylum, etc. There are many other cases as such to talk about, but because of the time constraints, I'm not going to be able to talk about those groups. If you go to Sweden, you will hear a lot of Turkish words, Ottoman words in the Swedish language today, which is because of the almost 20 years of residence of the King Charles XII of Sweden in Istanbul and also in the Balkans, or Levantines of Istanbul are still visible in the public space. And all these things that I have talked about, the peoples of Europe, the tribes of Europe, the ethnicities of Europe have been here making a lot of impact in everyday life of Istanbul. And now we see the same impact from the Syrian diaspora in Istanbul, from the Afghans, from the Pakistanis, from the Iranians, from the Ukrainians, from the Russians, etc., etc. This city has always been a refuge. Let me just, cut my talk here. I'm not saying this is a conclusion. This is a rather intermezzo where things continue to evolve, where things continue to unfold. I'll just read a very, famous poem by Yahya Kemal Beyatlı, a famous poet, Turkish poet. The Turkish version is known by everybody probably in Istanbul, but I'll just read the English translation. Yesterday, from a hill, I gazed at you, beloved Istanbul. No place exists in you that I have not roamed and loved. As long as I breathe, dwell sovereign in my heart. To love even one neighborhood of yours is enough for an entire life. The harmony of many peoples lives within your stones, in your temples, your marketplaces, your wind, your voice. You became a city where East and West embrace, carrying this union within yourself through the centuries. I guess this resonates to what Kavafis said earlier, and I think one of the speakers also referred to that. So I'll just cut it here, and thank you very much for your patience. I'll just stop sharing. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry, you couldn't hear all the applause for you, Ayhan. I hadn't yet gotten the sound back on. Thank you so much for that. Our second presenter is Laura Leonardi, who's professor in the Department of Sociology and Political Science at the Università di Firenze, where she directs the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence. Her own research focuses on sociological theory. One of her most recent publications is entitled Cosmopolitan Solidarity, a sociological perspective on values of the European Union, which appeared in the inaugural issue of the journal Interdisciplinary Review of Values. And she will be presenting indeed today on Meridian Cosmopolitanism, Reframing Europe and the Mediterranean.
Okay, I moved there. Okay. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you for your presentation. So first of all, I would like to take Ali Farka's invitation to free Europe seriously. This morning Ian Chambers showed that interesting video. So my starting point is Franco Cassano's meridian thinking, you know, and his Mediterranean historical cultural approach, mainly inspired by the idea of the longue durée by Fernand Braudel, because this offers also sociology and analytical and operational framework in which the valorization of cultural and historical differences become a lever for social emancipation. And it is precisely the idea of social emancipation that leads me to focus on the theme of meridian cosmopolitanism. And my argument is that meridian cosmopolitanism is not simply another version of cosmopolitan theory. It is a situated, conflictual, and relational practice. It emerges from borders, from navigation, from rescue, from ecological struggles, and from social mobilization. In other words, it does not begin from abstract universality. It begins from lived situations. I will develop this argument in 3 steps. The first, I will briefly clarify the epistemological approach and explain how meridian cosmopolitanism relates to other forms of cosmopolitanism. And second, I will connect meridian cosmopolitanism to the idea of the Mediterranean as an inverse landscape. And third, I will show how this perspective may help us reframe Europe, maybe a first step towards this idea to free Europe. Maybe this is a question. This is not, a statement. So, first point, my starting point, as I have said, is Franco Cassano's meridian thinking. But to define meridian cosmopolitanism, however, I also draw on the sociology of subjectivation, particularly the work of Alain Tourin and Michel Vieux-Yorca in France. And this means asking how social actors define themselves, their struggles, and the meaning of their actions. This is important because Western dominant discourse often makes these actors invisible. It often represents them as victims or threats or marginal figures, and meridian cosmopolitanism instead restores visibility to their agency. A second point is equally important. I do not understand conflict, antagonism simply as rupture. I mean conflict is a relational process, and social conflict is not necessarily the opposite of coexistence. Under certain conditions, conflictual relations can become a source of transformation, and it can open spaces for negotiation, recognition, and social dialogue. So this is particularly relevant today because the old sociological paradigm of social conflict, centered mainly on class struggle, is no longer sufficient, and globalization, migration, technological change, and ecological crisis have transformed inequalities. Conflicts concern not only distributive issues, but also identity, religion, ethnicity, territory, mobility, and recognition. And in many cases, these conflicts lack a shared symbolic space. This is precisely why new forms of dialogue and conflict regulation are needed. The so-called epistemologists from the South and from the peripheries, by adopting Eurocentric point of view, but remind us that classical cosmopolitanism has often remained ethnocentric, elitist, and abstract. It has often ignored everyday practices and has been tied to a model of unlimited growth. That has been contexted, particularly I refer to Deepesh Chakrabarty, for example. Yet cosmopolitanism should not simply be abandoned, but as Ariana Padurai and Chakrabarti suggest, it still preserves a powerful vocabulary of liberty, justice, and hope. And Meridian cosmopolitanism starts from this tension. It does not reject freedom, it redefines it. And the freedom that emerges from Cassano's Meridian thinking is not an abstract or uprooted freedom. It is a social freedom. It is produced through encounters and clashes between different cultural and social subjectivities. For this reason, I would define Meridian freedom through three key features. It is rooted in border experiences. It balances openness and rootedness, and it recognizes limits in relations with others. This contrasts with what we may call the oceanic freedom. Also quoting Cassano, the oceanic freedom of Western modernity, a freedom imaged as unlimited expansion, technological domination, and detachment from place. Meridian freedom is different. It does not deny limits. It inhabits them. It transforms them into opportunities for connection. And here, Cassano's metaphor of navigation becomes central. Navigation is not the fantasy of unlimited movement. It is the art of moving through constraints. It means reading winds, currents, coastlines, and dangers. And it means connecting local needs with broader horizon. And in this sense, Meridian cosmopolitanism is also close to Ayhan Kaya''s idea of the capacity to aspire, the capacity to imagine a new horizon starting from concrete life experiences. And I would now like to introduce a concept that helps maybe clarify Meridian cosmopolitanism. This is the idea of the inverse landscape, as suggested by neo-pragmatic geography. By inverse landscape, I mean a possible landscape that is already present in fragments, but remain hidden, blocked, or legitimized by dominant political and symbolic orders. This concept highlights contingency, and it accepts uncertainty. It reminds us that what exists before us is never the only possible form of social space. Applied to the Mediterranean, this means that the Mediterranean is not only a militarized border, it is also a hidden space of rescue, care, mobility, translation, and conflictual coexistence. If we consider the Mediterranean not simply as a body of water, but also a socio-material and symbolic landscape, then what we have called Fortress Europe appears as only one possible configuration of that space, because it is not natural, it is not inevitable, it is historical and political. Meridian cosmopolitanism can therefore be understood as the inverse of the dominant Mediterranean landscape. This is the inverse landscape of the Mediterranean. It reveals another Mediterranean, a Mediterranean already present in fragments, but often blocked, marginalized, or criminalized by border regimes. This inverse Mediterranean operates on at least three levels. Materially, it appears in rescue routes, civic harbors, reception, infrastructures, and networks of care. Symbolically, it challenges the representation of the Mediterranean as an impenetrable frontier. It reclaims it as a space of connection, exchange, and mutual vulnerability. Personally and politically, it is embodied by citizens, migrants, rescuers, activists, and communities who practice forms of localized agency despite differences and risks and asymmetries. This is why Meridian cosmopolitanism should not be understood as a naive utopia of harmony. It is not harmony indeed. It is negotiated coexistence. It is not the absence of conflict. It is an attempt to transform social conflict into social relation. From this perspective, Meridian cosmopolitanism is a social cosmopolitanism. And so it's from a cosmopolitanism from below, we should we could say, with Appadurai. It emerges across borders without erasing local belongings. Meridian cosmopolitanism begins from a situated universalism. It combines rootedness and openness. It sees antagonism and solidarity as equally constitutive of social life, and it builds alliances across plural subjectivities. Here, dialogue is central, but dialogue should not be idealized. It is never purely harmonious. It faces risks of both misunderstanding and, as Appadurai warns, over-understanding when consensus erases differences. This is also a risk. Zygmunt Bauman reminds us that common horizons are always temporary and renegotiable. And Richard Sennett speaks of informal dialogue in this case, the practical capacity of people from different backgrounds to invent ways of cooperating. This is very close to what I mean by Meridian dialogue. A Meridian dialogue rests on temporary common ground. The real challenge then is not simply to celebrate dialogue. The challenge is to institutionalize dialogic practices so that they become durable tools for conflict regulation and structural social change. So at this point, I would like to move from theory to practice. As a sociologist, I believe that concepts are useful if they can be operationalized. Empirical analysis is therefore essential. It allows us to test our categories, refine them, and sometimes transform them. So sociological and anthropological research has identified several areas where situated from below cosmopolitanism emerges. They are examples of Meridian cosmopolitanism. What these areas have in common is not the absence of conflictual social relations. Rather, they show how solidarity can be built despite or even through conflict across borders and from locally rooted experiences. And I will mention three examples. The first is migrant rescue and transnational reception by many local communities in different regional contexts. And I refer to the so-called Riace model and the search and rescue missions carried out by NGOs and volunteer groups in the Mediterranean. We have many examples of this. These social actors operate in space marked by storms, hostile bureaucracies, and militarized borders. These experiences go beyond maybe humanitarian aid. They become political acts. They resist securitarian logics and reaffirm the value of human rights in practice. The second example concerns struggles against global financial power. At the local level, these struggles often concerns workplace dignity, precarity, and social ecological rights, but they are also connected to wider transnational networks. And it's not just resistant to exploitation, it is also a process through which solidarity is built among very different social groups, calling for social justice in light of class, or generational, gender, or ethnic inequalities. The third example is concerns environmental mobilization. Each protest has its own local language, priorities, and cultural references. And yet together, these mobilizations produce a shared demand for climate justice. We can think also to Fridays for Future, for example. It was also, and so they create networks through which ideas, practices, and strategies circulate across borders. Despite their difference, these examples reveal the same pattern. They are grounded in specific contexts, and here the local is very important. They create solidarity through antagonism. They build transnational ties without losing local anchoring, and sometimes they open new possibilities for institutional change. And this is why Meridian cosmopolitanism is not merely an abstract concept. It is already present in the sea, in the streets, in neighborhoods, in civic harbors, in the collective responses to crisis. These practices reveal another Mediterranean within the existing one. They make the inverse landscape visible. So let me now come to the conclusion. What does Meridian cosmopolitanism have to do with Europe? My answer is that it does not come from outside Europe. It belongs also to Europe's own cultural and historical background and social ground, but it asks Europe to look at itself from another angle, from its border, from its south, from its crossings, from its social and cultural conflicts. In this sense, Meridian cosmopolitanism moves beyond the universalism-particularism divide. It does not choose between the local and the global. It connects them. It does not oppose identity and redistribution. It holds them together. It does not treat antagonism only as a threat. It sees it as a possible generator of transformations. Well, methodologically, this perspective is close to social intervention approaches inspired by Alain Tourin, Guy-Viorca, François Dippé, the French school founded by Alain Tourin. Such approaches do not see society only as a reproduction of domination. They see society as capable of producing itself through conflict, cooperation, and the transformative action of social actors, grassroots movements. This is why Meridian cosmopolitanism can serve both as an analytical lens and as a normative horizon. As an analytical lens, it allows us to see practices that dominant narratives often conceal. As a normative horizon, it allows us to imagine Europe differently. So in a Europe increasingly marked by fear, border closure, political fragmentation, Meridian cosmopolitanism reveals an inverse Mediterranean already present in fragments, and the Mediterranean is not a utopia of harmony, it is a conflictual space of negotiation, vulnerability, and shared action, of cultural creolization. But precisely for the reason it may help us rethink Europe, not as a fortress, but as a space capable of learning from its borders, its south and its encounters. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Laura. Our next speaker is Beatrice Falcucci, who is the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Fellow at the University of Florence and the University of Houston. And she has held numerous competitive fellowships. She works on Italian colonialism, material culture, and post-colonial memory, and is the author, among other works, of the 2025 L'impero nei musei, storie di collezione coloniale italiane, and co-editor of Traveling Matters Across the Mediterranean, Reshaping, Rereading, Reusing Objects. And she will be presenting today on the second-hand sea, circulation, appropriation, and reinterpretation of objects across the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to figure this out. Oh. Is it visible online? Yes, it is. Great. Okay, and I can move it from, no. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm the last one for today, so please bear with me a little bit more. And also my brain is pretty slow as I'm still jet lagged. So thank you so much for your patience. That's also the reason why I'm going to be reading in order to keep track of everything that I say and not exceed the time that I'm given. The Mediterranean has long occupied a privileged position in historical narrative of exchange, connectivity, and cultural encounter. From classical antiquity to the modern period, it has been described as a space structured by maritime routes, commercial networks, imperial expansion, and diasporic movement. Yet, while Mediterranean historiography has extensively examined flows of commodities, people, and ideas, it has often treated circulation as a unidirectional and terminal process. Goods are produced, exchanged, consumed, and eventually disappear from view. This paper proposed a different analytical perspective by focusing on second-hand objects, objects that outlive their original context of production and use, and that circulate through multiple regimens of value, meaning, and function. The aim of this paper is to highlight not only the movement of objects, but the practices and the form of knowledge intertwined with them, which shape their trajectories, inform their uses, and continuously redefine their meaning across different contexts. Conceiving the Mediterranean as a second-hand sea allows us to move beyond paradigms of primary exchange and to foreground reuse, appropriation, and reinterpretation as central historical process, rather than just marginal or derivative phenomena. Of course, any practice of rereading and reusing is never neutral or purely hermeneutic. It is, at its core, an intrinsically political act. Such an approach is deeply indebted to the intersection of Mediterranean history, material culture, anthropology, and archaeology. It builds on classical historiographical intervention from Fernand Braudel to Peregrine Orden and Nicolas Purcell, while integrating theoretical frameworks developed by scholars such as Arjuna Padurai, Igor Kopitov, Daniel Miller, Bruno Latour, and Jane Bennett. By placing objects at the center of the analysis and by following their extended biographies, this paper argues that secondary circulation is not merely a corrective to existing models, but a powerful heuristic for rethinking Mediterranean history as a whole. So, what about I make you disappear?
Repeat.
Make
Top
you
right,
smaller.
top right, yeah. So you're in the one in the middle. Maybe.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Any discussion of Mediterranean circulation must begin, of course, with Fernand Braudel's monumental Les Méditerranéens et le monde méditerranéen à l'époque de Philippe II. Braudel famously conceptualized the Mediterranean not as a political unit, but as a complex system structured by geography, climate, and long-term economic rhythms. While objects themselves remain largely implicit in his narrative, material flows of grain, metals, textiles, ships are integral to his vision of the longue durée. Braudel's emphasis on repetition, constraint, and slow changes provide a crucial foundation for thinking about reuse. In a world that is shaped by scarcity, the durability of objects and materials necessarily encouraged repair, recycling, and adaptation. Yet Braudel largely framed circulation in terms of systematic equilibrium rather than cultural transformation, leaving room for later scholars to foreground agency, contingency, and meaning. A major historiographical turning point came with Orden and Purcell, The Corrupting Sea, a study of the Mediterranean history, rejecting the idea of a unified Mediterranean civilization. They emphasized fragmentation, diversity, and what they termed as connectivity, the dense web of interactions linking micro-regions across the sea. Crucially, their model foregrounds circulation as an everyday, small-scale process driven by human mobility. Objects in this framework are rarely static. They move repeatedly across short distances, often changing hands and function. Although The Corrupting Sea pays limited, explicit attention to object biography, it emphasizes on connectivity, provides fertile ground for studying the cumulative effects of reuse and recirculation. David Abulafia's The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, reintroduced narrative agency for grounding merchants, sailors, and political actors. His Mediterranean is animated by intentional movement and conscious exchange. From Phoenician traders to medieval Genoese merchants, objects circulate as part of human strategies, ambition, and conflicts. While the book largely focuses on moments of first exchange, his work nonetheless highlights the longevity of material presence. Ports become sites of accumulation rather than mere transit points, and objects linger, accumulate, resurface, a condition that makes second-hand circulation almost inevitable. The theoretical foundation for studying second-hand objects lie in anthropology. Arjuna Purai's edited volume, The Social Life of Things, Commodities and Cultural Perspective, mark a decisive shift away from purely economic definition of commodities. Appadurai argued that objects move in and out of commodity phases, and that value is produced through social context rather than intrinsic properties. Building on this insight, Igor Kopitov's chapter, The Cultural Biography of Things, explicitly formulated the idea that objects have lives. They are born, transformed, reclassified, and sometimes die. Kopitov's central insight that objects should not be understood not through any fixed evidence, but through the shifting trajectory of their social lives, appears to closely echo Sergei Tretyakov's seminal 1929 concept of the biography of the object, though his intellectual depth remains strikingly unacknowledged. Applied to the Mediterranean, this framework invites historians to trace objects far beyond the initial moment of exchange. More recently, Mediterranean scholarship has explicitly adopted and reworked these theoretical tools to foreground mobility, reuse, and displacement as structuring conditions of material life. In this perspective, the volume I co-edited with Emanuele Giusti and Davide Trentacoste, Traveling Matters Across the Mediterranean, Rereading, Reusing, Reshaping Object, explicitly proposes movement, reuse, and transregional circulation as methodological categories. Rather than treating mobility as exceptional, what we tried to do was to conceptualize circulation and reuse as the normal condition of Mediterranean material culture. Classical Mediterranean archaeology has long relied on commodities, especially ceramics, amphora, and coinage, as primary evidence for a trade network. Works such as Rafael González Rubial's studies of material culture or Michael Fulford's research on Roman trade have demonstrated the scale and complexity of this system. Yet amphora used for storage containers, burial goods, or construction materials, and coins melted down, pierced, or reinscribed point to the extended material afterlives. These practices challenge sharp distinction between production, consumption, and disposal, suggesting a cyclical economy long before modern recycling ideologies. Few objects exemplify second-hand circulation as powerfully as architectural spolia. From late antiquity through the early modern period, columns, capitals, and marble blocks were systematically reused across the Mediterranean. Dale Kinney's seminal article, Spolia, Damnatio e Renovatio Memoriae, demonstrated that spoliation was not merely pragmatic, but deeply symbolic. And that's something I think that resonates with Khaled's critique of what classical means, but also what authenticity, I would say, means. Similarly, Richard Brilliant and Dale Kingsley edited volume Reuse Values, Spolia and Appropriation in Art and Architecture from Constantine to Sherry Levine situates spolia within broader debate about appropriation, memory, and authority. In a Mediterranean context, reused architectural remains and elements materialize claim to continuity, conquest, and legitimacy, embedding historical narratives directly into urban fabric. Also, religious artifacts, relics, icons, and manuscripts constitute a category of intensely mobile and mutable objects. As Peter Brown demonstrated in The Cult of the Saints, relics in late antiquity functioned as transferable sources of power, anchoring sacred presence in new locations. Later scholarships, such as Patrick Geary's Furta Sacra, theft of relics in the Central Middle Ages, has shown how forceful appropriation and reinterpretation were central to religious circulation. Relics frequently change owners, meanings, and ritual context, accumulating sacral biographies that defy linear historical narratives. While trade remains a fundamental mode of circulation, attention to second-hand economies shifts focus toward resale, repair, and redistribution. Studies of early modern marketplace, such as those by Lawrence Fontaine, The Moral Economy, highlight the centrality of used goods in pre-industrial economies, particularly among mobile and marginal population. Mediterranean ports from Alexandria to Venice functioned as hub of secondary circulation where objects entered new markets with altered values and meanings. Violence, of course, has always been a powerful engine of material movement. Warfare, piracy, and plunder redistributed vast quantity of objects across the Mediterranean. Objects captured in raids or battles often circulated widely detached from their original owners and context, and reintegrated into new social worlds. Migration constitutes a slower but no less transformative mode of circulation. As people moved voluntarily or forcibly, they carried objects that embodied memory, identity, and continuity. Daniel Miller's work on materiality, material culture, and mass consumption, or stuff, provides key insight into how everyday objects mediate belonging and adaptation. In the diasporic context, objects often became anchors of cultural translation, mediating between past and present, origin and destination. Recent work has powerfully demonstrated how contemporary Mediterranean migration produces new regime of second-hand materialities. Francesca Nichini's Tracce in Movimento, Oggetti, Migrazione e Memoria a Lampedusa offers a paradigmatic case in point. Focusing on objects recovered along migratory routes, clothing, documents, personal belonging, Anichini shows how migrant material culture is defined by loss, interruption, and reassemblage. These objects circulate between beaches, detention spaces, humanitarian archives, and museums, acquiring layered meanings that oscillate between evidence, memorial, and debris. In this sense, migrant objects represent an extreme and contemporary manifestation of Mediterranean second-handness. Circulation is shaped by precarity, violence, and uneven mobility regime. And I'm definitely thinking about Martha's presentation, mentioning the fetishization of migrants' objects. Such a difficult word. But of course, any discussion of second-hand circulation in the Mediterranean must ultimately confront the issue of colonialism. While the Mediterranean has often been framed as a space of reciprocal exchange and shared connectivity, post-colonial scholarship has demonstrated that circulation has rarely occurred under conditions of symmetry. From Roman imperial expansion to early modern maritime empires and 19th and 20th century European colonialism, the movement of objects across the Mediterranean has been deeply entangled with structure of domination, extraction, and epistemic violence. In this perspective, second-hand objects emerge not merely as evidence of reuse, but as a material witness to colonial temporalities. Anna Laura Stoller's work on imperial debris is particularly illuminating here. Stoller argues that colonialism should not be understood as a closed historical episode, but as an ongoing condition whose material residues continue to shape the present. Applied to the Mediterranean, this approach highlights how objects displaced during colonial encounters persist as unstable and contested artifacts embedded in an equal regime of knowledge and ownership. Colonialism profoundly altered the classification system that governed objects. As Nicholas Thomas has shown in Entangled Objects, Exchange, Material Culture, and Colonialism in the Pacific, colonial encounters did not simply transfer objects from one context to another. They transformed their meaning, values, and epistemic status. Although Thomas' work focuses on the Pacific, his framework is highly productive for Mediterranean contexts, where antiquities, ethnographic artifacts, and everyday objects were systematically reclassified through colonial and imperial lenses. During the 19th century, European archaeological and antiquarian practices extract vast quantities of material from Ottoman, North African, and Eastern Mediterranean contexts. Objects previously embedded in local circuits of reuse, architectural fragments, inscription, everyday tools, were recorded as antiquities, destined to Metropolitan Museum. Scholars such as Zeynep Çelik have demonstrated how this process involved not only physical displacement, but also the epistemic marginalization of local practices of reuse and stewardship. What had once been second-hand objects within local materials economy were now frozen into supposedly universal narrative of classical heritage. In this sense, colonial circulation often functioned as a process of desecondization. Objects were stripped of their layered biographies and reinserted into linear, hard historical or civilizational narratives, the privilege, origin over use, authenticity over adaptation. Museums occupy a central position, of course, in the colonial afterlives of Mediterranean objects. As Tony Bennett has argued in his The Birth of the Museum, museums are not neutral repositories, but institutions that produce knowledge, authority, and moral order. Mediterranean objects circulating into European collections were frequently detached from the secondary and tertiary use and reframed as timeless exemplars of civilization. Within museum studies, this condition has been theorized with particular clarity by Sandra H. Dudley. In Displaced Things in Museums and Beyond, Dudley foregrounds displacement as a key analytical concept, emphasizing how objects removed from the original context carry material, emotional, and ethical tensions into museum spaces. Dudley's work is especially productive for Mediterranean cases, where objects are not only geographically displaced, but also temporally and socially dislocated, severed from practice of reuse, repair, and everyday handling. From this perspective, museums appear as sites where second-hand circulation is both interrupted and reconfigured, transforming mobile and relational objects into fixed heritage goods. This museological logic often raised practices of reuse as signs of decay or degeneration. Again, spolia-repaired ceramics or hybrid artifacts posed classificatory problems and were frequently marginalized in displays or archive. Colonial asymmetries also structured informal and marginal economics of reuse. As Achille Bembe has argued on the post-colony, colonial and post-colonial society are characterized by improvisation, recycling, and creative survival within conditions of structural inequality. In Mediterranean colonial and semi-colonial contexts, particularly in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, second-hand markets thrived as responses to dispossession, economic dependency, and restricted access to resources. Ethnographic and historical studies of urban spaces such as Algiers, Alexandria, and Istanbul reveal dense economies of repair, resale, and adaptation in which colonial goods were reappropriated and resignified. Here, second-hand circulation functioned not as a derivative practice, but as a form of material agency, allowing subaltern actors to negotiate and sometimes subvert colonial material regimes. This perspective resonates with the work of scholars such as Jen Bennett, whose concept of vibrant matter invites attention to the non-human agency of objects themselves. Colonial objects did not simply impose meanings, they were manipulated, resistant, and transformed through everyday practices of reuse. Integrating colonialism into the analysis of second-hand Mediterranean requires a methodological reorientation. It calls for what Walter Mignolo has termed as epistemic disobedience, a critical examination of the categories through which objects are studied, valued, and narrated. Such an approach also destabilized the temporal hierarchies that have long structured Mediterranean historiography. By founding persistence, adaptation, and return, it challenges narrative that locate creativity exclusively at the moment of origin or conquest. Instead, it reveals colonialism itself as a force that multiplies objects' biography, producing unstable and unfinished material history. The last slide, if I can get to it. Okay. So in conclusion, conceiving the Mediterranean as a second-hand sea fundamentally reshapes historical inquiry. It shifts attention from origins to trajectories, from production to transformation, and from linear exchange to recursive movement. Objects emerge not as static sources, but as dynamic historical actors embedded in a network of reuse, memory, and power. Methodologically, this approach demands a great attention to material temporality and willingness to treat degradation, fragmentation, and reuse not as noise, but as historical signal. Reuse becomes not a sign of decline or backwardness, but a creative and adaptive response to the Mediterranean condition of mobility, scarcity, connectivity, and colonialism. Ultimately, the second-hand sea is not, I propose, a marginal analytic category. It is the Mediterranean itself, reused, reproposed, and endlessly reinterpreted through the objects that have traversed its water. Thank you.
Thank you for these three really wonderful papers. Through virtually no fault of the presenters, because we started late, we have, in principle, just a few minutes, but certainly we should have time for at least a couple of questions after a long day. Go ahead.
I just one quick question to Beatrice. I wonder if there is a change because there is a economies of reuse in the Mediterranean, but the two things. One is that the impact that reuse is having on some of these economies. For example, the excess of I know that the excess of clothing has come from the United States to Africa, has basically killed off textile industry. And then now, of course, also second-hand cars and American cars that have been put out of because the insurance purposes have also, there isn't going to be any auto industry locally necessarily, but what's happening is we make it to some, it's a really transfer of waste, second-hand, but also trashification, as the signing of one said, which is meaning that you're kind of the Europe and the industrial world wants to throw something in the trash, but there is a market for this trash that could extend its life. But it's also capitalism being so dependent on production and not on repair, as you say, that only the other sites of the world have become the site of repair. But by becoming the site of repair, you're also becoming the site of trash and debris. So I wonder if there's kind of a late capitalism formula that has kind of put an end to second-hand use. I will also say that I know that, and I read about this, that in Rome, because you mentioned amphorae, in Rome there's I read about a place where ancient amphorae that had never been put into use have been piled up and have now gone back. So are we talking about a limit of second-handness that has already been there, or are we also talking about kind of late capitalism overproduction, creating trash that is not going to go anywhere, or has that been with us all along? But now we're talking about bigger volume. So just of challenging the model.
Yeah.
And before you respond, I'm
Sure.
going to actually collect any questions that remain just in the interest. Yeah, Ian, please.
I want to say something about the first talk by Ayhan on Istanbul, which the whole thing about stratification, rhizomatic sedimentation in the city, and to think about some of the other languages which permit us to register that. There's two films, one by the German-Turkish director Fatih Akin, Crossing the Bridge, which is all about the demonstration of what you were talking about, how north, south, east, west is sort of there in the sands. The whole film is based in sands. And there's another one by Tony Gatliff, the Rom director, called Latchodrome, which talks about the migration of Roma culture from Reichsstamm into Spain. But it opens up questions about how music or the sounds are also proposing critical journeys. The idea of sort of histories, cultures are sustained and suspended in sound, which opens up a whole nother space which more institutional historiography doesn't often register. And then Laura, I want to, well, I mean, Franco Cassano is very, very important work, but there's a certain tension between Franco Cassano's understanding of the Mediterranean and Southern thinking, and what we heard this morning from Khaled, where Khaled presented a much more sort of realized understanding of the classical world, was I feel that Franco Cassano, he worked much more of an idea as Greek classical world as a sort of lodestone, as a reference point, almost as though it's homogeneous and it provides a counterbalance, or what you called an inverse landscape. And we heard in Ayhan's talk the invitation to abandon, I don't know, dualism or binary thinking, Cartesian dualities, which I think are not. Actually, you gave a very sensitive reading, but I think there's a sort of tension here, which at least we can register it. You know.
That's why
Okay.
That's why I try to
Hold on just 1 second, because I'm just gonna.
Okay.
So, were there any? All right, I'm gonna run to all three, but very quickly. But you can very much choose not to answer it. But I was really fascinated by the kinds of similarities between the rhizomatic metaphor, meridian, cosmopolitan, and notions of complex systems of circulation and the objects within them. And I'm just curious if any of you had any thoughts about how these, if you do think these various metaphors really and realities work together or are strikingly different. So do you want to start with? Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for the idea of becoming site of repair. That means becoming site of trash, and I'm thinking about actual trash. You know, the movement of especially the toxic waste. This is something that also happened in the Italian case. I'm thinking about the toxic trash that was sent to Somalia during the 90s, for example, the 80s and the 90s, for example. So, I mean, I definitely have to think about it more. This is very interesting, and it is very interesting. It kind of connects to what we were saying at lunch, the idea that you only know how to repair things if you cannot afford to buy directly new one. So yeah, thank you for the comments. Thank you very much.
And Ayhan, do you want? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just very briefly, I think it was Ian who talked about Fatih Akın's movie. It is a great movie, but I don't know the other one, Tony Gatliff. But yes, you're right. Especially Istanbul is a great source of cultural capital for the members of the Turkish diaspora, artist and literature community. So that is there. And Belinda, for your question, I think there were really interesting commonalities and common grounds between those three papers. Just to pick up just a couple of them, I think Meridian cosmopolitanism makes a lot of sense from also the place where I am standing now, Istanbul. And I could add into the debate with the introduction of vernacular cosmopolitanism as a kind of critique of this northern, Western, Eurocentric perspective in a way. And what Beatrice said in terms of mobility being the norm, I think it is also important. Yes, in the Mediterranean context, as well as in the other contexts as well, mobility of peoples, mobility of symbols, mobility of objects should be the norm. And we should also, as scholars of social sciences, we should also continue to promote this norm, as opposed to the detrimental effects of the nation states, boundaries and borders, etc. So it was really fascinating dialogue for me, although it was a bit difficult with this online hybrid communication, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ayhan. And now, please go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, of course, that is strange, and maybe I didn't see it completely to do that. That's why, starting from Cassano, I shifted to Appadurai, for example, and of course Chakrabarti, and also Mignola for some. I haven't quoted all the literature I referred to, but it's my aim was that Meridian cosmopolitanism, that is a cosmopolitanism from below, if we want, as defined, but is something that happened in the Mediterranean, and it's something that also begins to Europe. Excuse me, I'm confused now. Also belongs to Europe. There is also that. It's the other kind. It's the other face of the coin of what Paolo Novak was describing, referring to movies, for example. Wim Wenders' The Fly on the reception of refugees in Badolato in 1998 when the carts arrived on the coast of the Calabria, region. Is the other side of the coin, is a Meridian cosmopolitanism. People were migrants and they welcomed those carts, they arrived, they opened their houses. The houses were empty because everyone was immigrated to other continents. But they recognized them as, people who were doing what they have been doing. There was, I have been working on that. So people said, well, my father went to the South America. My sons have been immigrating to Switzerland. And now people come. They come here. They have our, needs. I can recognize them. They have our needs. Well, open the houses because, and so children have to go to school. So everything was, some natural. Of course, it was also conflictual because there were also people who were not so, they didn't agree, but there was also the capacity to go of governance of this. And as more, in Calabria, there were all small towns completely white because people were emigrated because they are poor, they are still poor. But they were able to build the Riace model that was, of course, is an inverse landscape of Italy. It isn't only the model that Paolo was showing, the cast. And so I think we need to also to look at what's happening. People are also able to be subjects, to promote change, to have different values.
So one thing is conflictual coexistence is a term that's used by speakers as well. As I
Yeah.
Right? And she does that in nation and education. Research very important to me because it's about partition.
Yeah.
About what partition derives, right? And of course, and I love that phrase because I think that even in critique, sometimes the fantasy is of conflict-free coexistence.
Yes.
And if that becomes the right, I mean, if that becomes the kind of baseline of our argument, then we can't have it. The second thing I want to say, one of the reasons I liked what you're doing on having talked extensively to refugees now, both in Lesbos and now in Siena, right? They're going through all kinds of things. On the other hand, people also want a narrative of the possibility of coexistence. That isn't just critique, because they have to live here, right? In these complex conditions. So part of, I mean, I'm talking about what I'm hearing, and of course, when I can go in with my like lens, and I want to be very critical, but then that's not what. But then I get resistance in what? Right? Because the thing you're trying to romanticize where we came from, and you're making it impossible for us to live here. So, I mean, I think it's kind of also worth keeping that in mind. Finally, I want to say it's a fantastic panel. I think it's an amazing end to a wonderful day. Thank you very much. And what's exceptional about it is that I'm still awake. We
are all awake. Thank you very much.
I didn't want to do in the last one. I just leave, and I didn't. So thank you very much, and I hope that we can all talk again soon.
Thank you.
Let us thank our panel. Thank all people organizers who brought us together.
Thank you, Sadia.
And
Thank you for
now
all
we're also
the
making it possible here.
So good to see you, Ayhan. See you soon.
Thank you very
Ayhan.
much. All the best to everyone. Thank you. It was great. Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Shall I close it?
Yeah, yeah.
Ciao.